everyone. Welcome to PIR Center's webinar, Strategic Stability or Instability in Europe and Asia, Pathways Towards Risk Reduction and De-escalation. We are very happy to be able to discuss this hot topic today, despite all the challenges, or probably because of all the challenges that we are facing, both globally and regionally. Let me just begin with a few housekeeping rules for us all that will guide today's event, and then I will also discuss for 2 minutes the content of today's meeting. So my name is Artem Kvartalnov. I'm a junior research fellow at PIR Center, and I will be moderating today's event. Our webinar will be structured as follows. We will begin with introductory remarks by Dr. Vladimir Orlov, PIR Center's founder and director. Then we expect to listen to several presentations and we will also report the results of a track 2 event that took place yesterday and was co-organized by PIR Center. And afterwards, we hope to have a free and open discussion with everyone here, touching upon different dimensions of the topic that we are covering today. Basically, that's it from my side, and I'd like to, pass the floor to Dr. Vladimir Orlov, PIR Center's founder and director. Dr. Orlov, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Artem. Good afternoon, everybody. To the substance of what we hopefully will be discussing today during the next hour and a half and up to 2 hours. This is both about nuclear phobias, but also about nuclear related solutions. We and normally as organization oriented at solutions, we are willing to provide ideas what can and should be done, and providing solutions is easy. In easy times is easier. Providing solutions in more challenging, more difficult time is certainly more challenging, so we probably will come up with a certain menu today and would like to get your critiques as we got critiques of other experts in the previous days and weeks. I'm now talking to you not from Moscow. I'm now in the Central Western Europe and quite far away from Moscow. Actually, these days it looks like I am even further from Moscow than ever before. I felt in Europe. Only 16 hours of flight from Moscow to Vienna. This is certainly demonstrates how Europe and the European space has dramatically changed, but this is of course just a symbolic demonstration because the changes are much more profound. And I also should say that I'm pleased that here in the Central Western Europe I have been holding a number of meetings and consultations, and what is important to me, that the dialogue on nuclear related issues, particularly on the issues involving nuclear escalation, nuclear risk reduction, it has not stopped. It continues, it goes through different avenues and different forums. It is also true that for the first time in the last 30 years or so, not only experts, but also ordinary people in Europe start thinking again about nuclear weapons and nuclear dangers. So it's much less about Greta now and much less about climate change and much more about nuclear challenges and threats. And ordinary Europeans feel very vulnerable today. They definitely haven't felt so vulnerable for the last 30 years, and the current situation very clearly reminds many of us of the nuclear dangers, nuclear escalations of the early 1980s. I was interviewed by a major Spanish newspaper. A journalist who interviewed me turned out to be of my age and son of very highly positioned former Cuban diplomats. So he had spent his own childhood in Moscow, as I did, though later on moved back to Cuba and then to Spain. He shared with me how much the general person in Southern Europe, and Spain in particular, has fears about the current nuclear escalation, particularly on the nuclear rhetoric, which is very much in the media. And he asked me, Volodya, don't you remember that we were full of nuclear fears when we were 8, 10 years old in Moscow, that we were fearing nuclear war starting? But then our records started to differ. I said, yes, I remember. But in mid-1970s, when I was 8 or 10, my fears were not about United States attacking Soviet Union. My childhood fears, coming from the media and from talks with others, with the grown-ups, were nuclear war with China. And only later on, by early 80s, those fears and phobias, they probably switched to the United States and to the West. This is actually not just my memory, but also something for our discussion. Thinking of a specific nuclear escalation on the European theater, we should not forget that players are multiple. And of course, I also should tell you, this is the picture here, which I found on a very peaceful embankment of Lac Léman of Lake Geneva. Of course, the Swiss, much more than ordinary Europeans, were always preparing for something. Just their character was like that. And every Swiss, by law, had an obligation to have its own nuclear shelter and keep its own set of goods there. Of course, for the last 30 years, the Swiss were mostly keeping these shelters as cave, keeping good wine there in the shelters. And although this is a picture how the Swiss are cleaning the shelter, the truth, not only the picture, but the truth is that people here are obliged to put new sets of goods in the shelter for the 3-4 weeks of the nuclear war to come. And this is not necessarily wine. The phobias are back, the fears are there, and not necessarily everyone meets it with a smile like we do with this particular picture. Of course, it has been taken very, very seriously, both by ordinary people, but also by the decision makers. So now I put 10 points in the next 10 minutes on certain ideas of what can be done in the times of strategic instability in Europe, and also finding the pathways towards risk reduction and de-escalation. First of all, we should learn from history. We should learn from history also the way who establishes the rules in this world. We should look back 60 years ago to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this year is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we look back, we would see that the Soviet deployment of missiles and also nuclear warheads in Cuba was not illegal. It was a response to the real threat to the Soviet national security, when the United States decided that they feel more comfortable with putting the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Although it was not illegal what Soviet Union did, United States had found it unacceptable for its own security. So it's not only about the treaties, not only about the rule of international law, which is certainly more dead rather than alive today, but also about the assessment of and perceptions also of security of the nuclear haves, whether Russian Federation or others. The second point is directly to the situation we are witnessing now in Ukraine. Although the Russian special operation in Ukraine and putting Russian nuclear weapons on high alert did provoke a lot of discussion on the role or increased role of nuclear weapons, we must realize that nuclear weapons, if they are used, will not be used in the Ukraine conflict. I am even not referring to the discussions between the chiefs of staff of Russia and the United States, of the defense ministers. Lines of communications would exist, or just the lack of need to use nuclear weapons in this regional conflict. But nuclear weapons can be used. They're not 100% political weapons. And more likely, if they're at all used, they would be used in different theaters in the Middle East, or even more likely in South Asia or in Northeast Asia. And so while thinking now on the European theater, we should not forget others. Point number 3. How we connect the dots between current nuclear rhetoric and nuclear escalation and the forthcoming NPT review conference in New York in August, where actually we would celebrate slightly belatedly the 50th anniversary of the NPT. But we also would have to peacefully coexist with the new treaty, which is a TPNW. Actually, there will be a lot of challenge for all nuclear weapon states, not only to the Russian Federation regarding the implementation of the Article 6 of the treaty. Point number 4, P5 and role of P5. I would suggest that we should not underestimate a statement declaration made by the P5 in January this year, just a few months ago, where it was stated by all nuclear weapon states in accordance with the NPT that the nuclear war cannot be won and shall never be fought. But I would invite our speakers and our participants today also to comment on how this statement matches the reality today and the forthcoming NPT review conference. Point number 5. While P5 declares that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, there is a real risk of increase of nuclear arsenals by nuclear weapon states. Of course, we may talk of qualitative increase, but I also keep in mind quantitative increase. In my view, this is worrisome. Again, here, it's not limited to one nation. We saw these developments, at least in the United Kingdom recently, and we at least have been following the speculations regarding People's Republic of China in that direction. I believe that it is important to call against further increase of number of nuclear weapons by nuclear weapon states, as well as all states possessing nuclear weapons. Point 6, CTBT. Again, just as I was in Vienna just a few days ago, and I saw quite a number of activities surrounding CTBTO there. One should not forget that there is no CTBTO, there is CTBTO-PC. There is no organization because there is no existing treaty, no treaty into force. My point is that this is another very dangerous global development when after 30 years, the international community failed to enter into a new phase of, if you like, arms control through the prohibition of nuclear testing. In my view, there should be a call made for the CTBT to enter into force by 2016, by the 30th anniversary of its opening for signature. I know this is not overambitious, although some people from Vienna may tell me that this is, in fact, overambitious. Hopefully, I'm not talking completely unrealistic issues now, and I'm sure this is the right moment to raise them. Number 7, more nuclear weapon-free zones. We have a vibrant discussion on these issues yesterday, and Artem will come back to that shortly. But my point today is that the more nuclear weapon-free zones, the better. It is absolutely true that the zones cannot be enforced. They cannot be established without the will of participating or potentially participating nations. But it is also true that the risk of placement of nuclear weapons outside of national territories of certain nuclear weapon states has been increasing. So far, we have only one nuclear weapon state, United States, to actually to keep some of its nuclear weapons outside its national territory on the land in Europe. But if others like Russia or China would follow mentioning their own interests, whatever region they would keep in mind, Central Europe or Indian Ocean, that definitely would be a very dangerous Pandora box. And of course, TPNW, with all its problems, partially provides here a healthy solution. But for those who are not there and who have problems with entering TPNW, the nuclear weapon-free zone mechanism certainly is important, including, in my view, a corridor or zone from Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, although I know the criticism how unrealistic this might seem today. Number 8, I believe one should call against, strongly call against degradation of strategic stability in its formats. And of course, we are witnessing just right now this degradation further on. There is a freeze, deep freeze on the strategic stability discussions or talks between Russian Federation and the United States. For those of us who are now in Geneva from this group, actually even passing through Lviv, now it's not a good memory of what happened a year ago, but a very bitter feeling of opportunities lost at what had been believed to be Geneva spirit of Putin-Biden summit, but turned out into something which did not respond to the challenges of global security and did not fix the strategic stability problems. Number 9, nuclear risk reduction could and should become an important topic for work of expert community, as it already, the work started in a number of places, including UNIDIR, including others. I think this is important because the issue of accidents, the issue of channels of communication, and other issues associated with nuclear risks is something on demand today. And last but not least, I must say that we should strongly support engaging of young generation of arms control, non-proliferation, and nuclear security experts. Those people who lack the experience of the traditional Cold War, of those phobias of the 1970s, of those nuclear escalation of the 1980s. I think you may and should think out of the box very creatively. In that sense, the traditional peer center's role in promoting disarmament and non-proliferation education is particularly important this year, when we not only witness these threats and challenges, but also celebrate the 20th anniversary of the report of the study by the Secretary General of the United Nations, which had launched the serious chain of very positive developments of promoting nuclear education, nuclear disarmament, and non-proliferation education in various regions of the world, including my country, Russian Federation. So this is quite a set of menu. There are some more for the long term, some I think for the immediate reactions. And now I return the floor back to our moderator and look forward to our presentations of our two presenters, Dr. Rauf and Dr. Topychkanov, who I very much like to see. And now, Artem, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Orlov, for your very insightful presentation. So let me remind the participants that we will try to first present the results of our yesterday's discussions, just to really provide some food for thought, because there were quite a lot of ideas, some of which have already been mentioned. And then we will pass the floor to our dear guests or dear presenters, and then we'll have the discussion. So let me just share my screen with the presentation so that I can really illustrate the materials that we have. Basically, yesterday, PIR Center co-organized with the Geneva Center for Security Policy a track to event called Danger of Nuclear War and Strategic Instability, Is De-escalation Feasible? You can see that the topic to some extent resembles the topic of today's webinar, but we've chosen to change, the emphasis so that we can discuss broader issues that are not limited to US-Russia relations today. And the presentation that I have now is mostly focused on US-Russia relations. Well, you see that we actually live in a moment when in 1 week we will have 1 year after the summit in Geneva, where President Biden and President Putin met. So basically, it is a very interesting moment to be discussing these issues. And let me just begin summarizing the discussion yesterday. It was, of course, the Chatham House rule discussion, so we are not attributing any ideas to anyone, but this is anyway very helpful and will hopefully provide some ground for the discussion today. So the first topic that we discussed yesterday with high-ranking representatives just from academia and from think tanks in Russia and in the United States was the risk of nuclear escalation as such. We did touch upon the issue of corridors free of nuclear weapons that has already been touched upon today, and we actually saw divided opinions on this because on one hand such corridors indeed may increase stability. Some participants were skeptical of the probability of the implementation of such corridors or zones, because even 20 years ago Belarus was the only country that was in favor of such zones in the region. Another topic that was discussed is that combat actions involving a nuclear weapon state and a non-nuclear weapon state are not unprecedented. So basically the very fact that such kind of combat actions increases the likelihood of escalation dramatically. Well, this very argument is not really feasible, because the Chinese-Vietnamese war 40 years ago was a different example of such a conflict. We also know that Russia did not use tactical nuclear weapons in northern Ukraine during the current conflict, and chose to withdraw its forces, which was actually considered by some participants of yesterday's dialogue as a sign that the escalate to de-escalate logic does not work and probably is not realistic either. Another idea that was covered yesterday is that we need to think of very specific nuclear escalation scenarios instead of simply saying that something might happen because the specific actor possesses nuclear weapons, because escalation must have very specific origins. So one possibility is Russia, shooting down an airplane that would have NATO instructors in it. Another opportunity is when the other side does something like this, but we also know that some historical examples demonstrate that nuclear escalation or even other kinds of military escalation are not that likely afterwards, because when Turkey shot down a Russian airplane 7 years ago or 8 years ago, well, nothing happened, and political and economic escalation did not result into some form of military escalation. Well, the first part of this section was focused on the idea that escalation is not that much likely, but some of the participants mentioned a very interesting idea that the conflict that began on February 24th was not considered likely or necessary by many observers in Russia and the West, which means that probably even impossible things and events can be considered possible today, which means that we cannot forget about all those scenarios that are not considered highly probable. Another thing is that a nuclear strike that involves NATO countries and a nuclear strike in the territory of Ukraine are two different things that and two different events that can lead to different kinds of consequences. So a use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine might not lead to nuclear retaliation, and this was a consensus position. Well, not a consensus position, but this was shared by both Russian and American participants. But there was also an idea that the United States might use a different form of retaliation if we end up seeing a nuclear use in Ukraine, which is still something considered very unlikely, as I said earlier. Another interesting idea is that typically we say that incidents are not that likely because there are quite a lot of systems preventing them, but in a situation where there is no trust, incidents are getting more likely, and escalation resulting from incidents should be considered a real possibility today. The participants were really trying to compare this to some situations in the 1990s, saying that there was trust and there was respect at that point, and that the very fact that escalation did not happen in the 1990s does not mean that it will not result from an incident today. So let me move on to the strategic stability dialogue and destabilizing weapons part. Which is also something that Dr. Orlov has already touched upon. Well, our guests, our experts believe that strategic stability dialogue will not be renewed in its previous format in the near future. And this is also the idea that was probably shared by most speakers. This does not only result from some political reasons, because there are also practical reasons and practical problems behind this. We have very little time for a new start, and it is very difficult today to discuss progress. We can only retain and keep what we already have, and this would have a substantial impact on the content of those negotiations. So another idea is that multilateral forums might be more useful today than bilateral engagement, simply because actors might be more willing to discuss issues multilaterally. Types of weapons do not matter that much because it is more important to understand where you place weapons, and how you use them. So this again brings us back to the issue of scenarios. So another idea mentioned with regard to this point was that the Ukraine conflict shows that so-called strategic weapons can be used for tactical purposes, and this reshapes our understanding of global and regional balances. Another point that was very important is on external factors that might influence the dynamics of US-Russia arms control in the near future. So one is obvious and was obvious previously is China. Of course, the United States will be factoring in China when making arms control decisions, but the other idea is sanctions. So some participants pointed out that Russia is highly unlikely to engage in any kind of arms control negotiations while sanctions are still there, well, in their current form. Another idea that was very interesting, but that does not really exist in today's reality as a political problem, is that the US and Russia were really able to capitalize on the momentum that resulted from Russia's security demands in December 2021, because the parties were really ready to discuss what is going on, to discuss long-term concerns. But February 24th really made those discussions impossible for the United States, and Russia was also stating afterwards that it is not interested in the discussions the way they were framed previously. Probably the most positive thing about what has already been mentioned is that compartmentalization is still possible. This means that basically when you face political constraints in one area, you are still able to discuss different kinds of things in a different area. And an important idea, well, an important example was given. It is the P5 statement. Well, when it was signed several months ago, well, basically in winter, the US was already sure that Russia's military operation in Ukraine would begin, but the US and its allies still agreed to basically reaffirm that there should be that a nuclear war should not be fought. And this is an example of compartmentalization that could be used in the future, just to frame new agreements and new arrangements, both regionally and globally. The conflict in Ukraine will most likely raise the importance of conventional weapons, according to some of the participants, because we have seen once again that conventional weapons are the kind of weapons that is really used on the battlefield. We are always discussing the risk of nuclear use, but we end up having heavy local conflicts that involve conventional weapons, and probably some countries, including those pacifist countries, previously pacifist countries like Germany, will put an emphasis on conventional weaponry, and this is probably a factor, according to some participants, that will exist for several decades. The resulting idea is that we need to restore conventional arms control in Europe, because otherwise those weapons that are being manufactured today for those countries and by those countries, they may end up used in a different region, in different contexts, like in conflicts in Africa or elsewhere in the world. And if there is no conventional arms control, we will have to deal with all those problems in the future. Another idea that, well, is not so much empirically grounded, because we really lack access to this information, is that Russian conventional precision-guided munition arsenals can be depleted as a result of the current conflict, of current combat actions, and some participants believe that this could take us back to the 2000s with a strong focus on tactical nuclear capabilities in Russia's military strategy and, well, military doctrine. Though this idea was not really discussed for long, and it is not really clear whether a lot of participants were really agreed with it. A very optimist, but I'm not sure, but it's whether it is really feasible idea is that a build-up in Eastern Europe that we are experiencing today might lead more countries to question the value of the CFE treaty. Well, this is indeed likely, but the more interesting conclusion that was drawn by some of the participants from this is that a new treaty may emerge from this situation of growing discontent with the previous treaty, because more countries will finally understand that they can't live with the previous treaty. This is what Russia basically understood in 2007 and finally in 2015, right? Those are all ideas that I wanted to cover from the event that took place yesterday, from the dialogue that took place yesterday. I wanted once again to emphasize that it was very interesting, and I really hope that these ideas will provide some, background for today's discussions. And well, based on our agenda, we have two speakers today that are invited to present. Those are Dr. Petr Topychkanov, Associate Senior Researcher in the SIPRI Weapons of Mass Destruction Program and Senior Researcher at IMEMO here in Moscow, and Tariq Rauf, member of PIR Center Advisory Board and former Head of Verification and Security Policy Cooperation at the International Atomic Energy Agency. So, Dr. Topychkanov, don't you mind being first now, and so that Tariq Rauf could speak after you?
Thank you so much, Artem. It's my pleasure to join the today conversation, and already Dr. Vladimir Orlov and you bring so many ideas to reflect and to think about, because you touched almost every possible issue related to nuclear arms control and disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. Artem, when we discussed my role in the today meeting, you asked me to cover the impact that the conflict in Ukraine may have on non-European countries and regions, such as countries in India, Pakistan, probably China, Middle East. But before going into details, I would like to just to bring some reflection on what you mentioned and Dr. Orlov already mentioned. The first point is the conflict in Ukraine isn't over. Even we don't see any de-escalation symptoms in this conflict. And as I argued in my publications and public interventions, when we are in the process of escalation and the active use of violence by the sides involved in this conflict, unfortunately, we cannot rule out the possibilities that scenarios of escalations might include a nuclear war. So, of course, there is a very unlikely situation, as you mentioned, based on the your yesterday meeting, that it's very unlikely that Russia, for instance, would use nuclear weapons against Ukraine or in Ukraine. But because the sides involved are in escalation mode right now, the nuclear use scenarios cannot be ruled out. This is the first point. The second point, yes, Russia didn't use nuclear weapons, but to be honest, nuclear weapons are in use during this conflict. Because the role of nuclear weapons as a deterrent was already functional at the beginning of this confrontation, when the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, warned the NATO countries about unthinkable consequences of actual military involvement in this crisis. And as a reaction by the leadership of NATO countries, such as the United States and others, they reflected on that and mentioned several times that there is no plan to send the troops, the NATO troops, to Ukraine to fight with Russia. And of course, the message from Russia was very clear. And this message had a nuclear dimension of this conflict. And this message was received. And from this point of view, nuclear weapons were part of this confrontation and played their role in deterring further involvement of NATO countries into the direct conflict with Russia. Also, I have to say that, as you mentioned also, Artem, the conventional role, this conflict demonstrated several very important things, blurring the space between nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons that can bring the effect of nuclear weapons. I can mention two things. The first thing is that in this conflict, we heard the reports about using missiles that can be used for delivering nuclear warheads, but they were used with conventional warheads. So we could see that there were many examples, to be honest, including such as missiles launched from sea, air launchers, and land launchers, mostly from Russia, but also from Ukraine, targeting military and non-military targets. And it brings back the conversation about limiting such capabilities. There were a big debate before this crisis and even earlier in 1980s about limiting cruise missiles. Partially, this solution, this problem was solved with the help of the INF Treaty. But besides the INF Treaty context, still there were discussions about limiting this kind of capabilities. And what we see right now in Ukraine, it makes us think even more seriously about how to deal with this problem. How to deal with the problem related to using cruise missiles. What is the role of cruise missiles as a stabilizing or destabilizing instrument, especially now when we have an active armed conflict in Europe. Another issue related to use of conventional weapons, and it was debated in UN many times, that conventional weapons can bring destruction even more serious than, for instance, one use of, for instance, of one warhead. That, for instance, small arms took so many lives if to compare with, for instance, with actual uses of nuclear weapons in Japan many years ago. And what we now see in Ukraine with very severe destructions of cities and with effect reached against civil population, against towns and cities, it's quite similar with the fact that can be achieved, for instance, with a unique use of nuclear weapon. So my point is that yes, the nuclear weapon still the most powerful weapon, and we're lucky that the nuclear weapon wasn't used in this crisis and wasn't used for decades after the Second World War. But still, with conventional weapons, the effect may be achieved quite similar and quite serious, including affecting countries far beyond the crisis, including in the area of food security, ecology, migration, and so on and so forth. So it's a short reflection to what you described in your presentation. As for the effect for other countries, I would like to mention several points. The first point, few days ago, if I'm not wrong, 2 days ago, the Foreign Minister of India, Jai Shankar, making his presentation in Europe, mentioned that, look, not all your problems you have in Europe are not the problems of the world. The world has other very serious things, not always concentrated on the situation in the West or in Europe. It was his reflection to the question about how the situation in Ukraine and Europe affects India and the Indian situation. And it was his statement reflecting that it's not only solution to be focused on the Eurocentric perspective. There are other perspectives. Somehow, I think that it's a fair point, but at the same time, as my response to the statement, I would say that there are global problems, and of course, they are not always connected to the situation in Europe. And the nuclear non-proliferation is one of them. And of course, nuclear disarmament is another very important problem. But unfortunately, these problems are very connected to the situation in Ukraine. And I can mention several connections. One of them I already highlighted, and it was about cruise missiles and the blurring area between strategic conventional and nuclear weapons. Another point is about the prospects for the nuclear non-proliferation and the dialogue between the countries about that. I would like to remind you that at the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, even before, the Russian official concern was about the nuclear proliferation risks in Ukraine, related to the statement made by President Vladimir Zelensky in Munich about that Ukraine would consider revisiting its position about the Budapest Memorandum and non-nuclear status of Ukraine. The Russian officials used that as a pretext to respond to this proliferation threat, and it was mentioned by many statements, including statements from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and from the presidential administration and so on. Of course, I strongly believe that this issue should be raised during the REFCON conference, and it shouldn't be To be honest, I don't know how to manage this issue, because when Russia raised this problem publicly and officially and repeated again and again, of course, I believe that we would expect after 3 months of the armed conflict that let's have some facts from the ground, let's have some details. If Russia had these concerns, it means that Russia should build something based on these concerns and based on its actions in Ukraine. It means that if, for instance, Russia decides to mute these concerns with the ref phone or to avoid these conversations, so I don't know what the effect will be for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. My point is that Russia should have a clear position and to be ready to answer the questions from other members of the nuclear non-proliferation regime about these concerns and these questions that Russia raised before and at the beginning of this crisis. The second point is about disarmament concerns and nuclear arms control. It was already mentioned before me that there is a position articulated during your meeting yesterday that Russia wouldn't be interested in having a nuclear arms control dialogue with the United States while under sanctions. Probably I got this message wrong, but my belief is quite different, that Russia is still interested in nuclear arms control. And it was exactly what I heard from some people in Moscow, that, well, there are existing political problems, very strong disagreements, and of course tension is higher. But still, we are the members of the same non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And still we have commitments to continue efforts to disarm and to limit nuclear weapons. And of course, there is a very strong belief that the New START treaty isn't forever, and we have to think about the future after this treaty. And even if the current situation isn't welcoming and sanctions are expected to be for a very long period of time, I think that it's not a very serious obstacles for the Russian and US diplomats to sit together to discuss what is possible to do for preserving some kind of predictability and transparency for other countries. And I would like, it's not only expected from inside Russia, from me and from some people in the United States, it's expected from other countries as well. I would like to remind you, for instance, the official position of China. China that repeated many times, for instance, in the context of the INF treaty crisis, that for the sake of the nuclear disarmament and the NPT treaty regime, Russia and the United States have to preserve this treaty, save this treaty, and to continue the dialogue in this area. It was said during the growing disagreements between Russia and the United States about the NF. And that position of China was a good, I would say, pretext to be engaged with China and between Russia and the United States on these particular questions. Especially now, when there are growing concerns about that other escalations might happen in other parts of the world, including between China and its neighbors, China and the United States. So we have to preserve this dialogue. And my final point is, Dr. Vladimir Orlov mentioned at the beginning the statement made by P5 about that the nuclear war shouldn't be fought and cannot be won. And unfortunately, after that, there were many statements made by officials from some countries, including from Russia, from European countries, from NATO, and about the nuclear dimensions and nuclear threats. But here, I think that we have to be focused on restoring the signaling system. Because unfortunately, I think that it's quite a mistake that we pay a strong attention to the statements of people not involved in nuclear command and control. So the statements such as some journalists, some people not involved in commanding nuclear weapons, and even not responsible for presenting the country's positions, such as Russia, for instance. Of course, there is a very strong problem in many countries, including in my country as well, about the signaling system, when officials could produce conflicting statements about that they don't have any intentions to use nuclear weapons, but simultaneously they are ready to consider nuclear weapons as a response to growing threats to my country. And my outcome from this problem is not to cutting off the contacts in this area between nuclear weapon states, but preserving them and to stimulating officials from our countries to produce statements, very clear statements about that there is no nuclear weapons role in the conflict, such as the conflict in Ukraine. And it was my message at the beginning of this crisis. I repeated many times, and then I was lucky to see that time to time our officials started publicly, including our diplomats, our ministers, and officials started step by step repeating that. Of course, there is another big problem, the lack of trust. To be honest, the absence of trust. Before this crisis, I was thinking that, well, let's think about the trust as an exercise, trust as a result of mutual contacts, mutual exchanges. And of course, now it's not a welcoming situation for building trust between Russia and NATO, Russia and United States, between countries involved in the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. That is why my point is that unfortunately, there is no other way to stimulate trust-building exercises between nuclear, non-nuclear weapon states other than to limit and stop violence in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. After that, we would open more opportunities. As for now, it's my final point. The countries such as China, India, Pakistan, other nuclear weapon states, they're looking at this situation as quite dangerous and hoping that, and it was mentioned by officials such as including Prime Minister of India, they are hoping that the countries involved in this crisis, and mostly Russia and Ukraine, would find the point where they could stop the violence. After that, we would have more opportunities to build trust and to find ways out of this increased nuclear risks situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Petr. Thank you so much, Dr. Topychkanov, for your insightful presentation. Well, I'd like to pass the floor to Tariq Rauf, former head of Verification and Security Policy Cooperation at IAEA and member of PIR Center's Advisory Board. So if I'm not mistaken, Tariq Rauf wanted to discuss the way present concerns could be addressed at the upcoming review conference. So Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Artem, and thank you to both you and Dr. Orlov for organizing this very timely discussion. I was privileged to see Dr. Orlov in Vienna not that long ago, so I'm happy to see him again, although this time it is virtually. I unfortunately need to leave in about 20 minutes because I'm going to Geneva tomorrow and I need to get a corona test for that. So I will be very quick. One of the big concerns now is that the current conflict in Ukraine will overshadow the discussions at the NPT review conference in August. We have already seen that here in Vienna at the IAEA's Board of Governors meetings in March, and the current IAEA Board of Governors meeting, which started on Monday, and is carrying on during this week. There were attempts by some to either expel Russia from the IAEA or to expel Russia from the Board of Governors. People have pointed out the number of Russians working at the IAEA, and they should be reduced. So this all is very non-productive and confrontational discourse. So in a previous discussion, where there were some people, including some who would be on the US delegation to the NPT and some other delegations, I had proposed that at the NPT review conference, in the first week, we have the general debate where all the countries make their opening statements, and then starting from week 2, the review conference begins its work in the 3 pillars of the treaty, in the 3 main committees on nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So my proposal was that during the first week, during the general debate, those countries that need to get items off their chest regarding Russia and Ukraine do so in the first week. And those countries that want to have a statement criticizing or condemning Russia, they can have a statement of like-minded states, and it doesn't need to be adopted by the conference of a whole. So those countries want to say something in such a statement, they can say it. And then we end the discussion on Ukraine and Russia, and starting in the second week, we really get to the business of the review of the treaty across its 3 pillars. This is not an entirely novel suggestion on my part. In March was the review conference of the amended Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. And there too, the discussion was going off tracks because at that time, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant site was under Russian control, as was the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So fortunately, they decided at that conference that they would have a separate statement criticizing Russia for its actions at the 2 nuclear power plants. And then they moved on to the business of the review of the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. Nonetheless, as you would know, starting from 2018, the atmosphere and discourse between the 2 largest possessors of nuclear weapons started to deteriorate in the NPT review conference context, because until then, until the PrepCom in Geneva in 2018, whatever their problems might have been between Russia and the United States, they did not bring those problems into the NPT. There, they were more or less on the same page, which is to prevent further proliferation of nuclear weapons, to strengthen IAEA safeguards, nuclear safety and security. But starting in 2018, as the atmosphere started to deteriorate, they started fighting with each other in the PrepCom. And this discourse became even worse in the 2019 PrepCom in New York, which was then exacerbated by Russian complaints that several of the members of the Russian delegation did not get visas to New York in time or got the visas very late. And so, as we can imagine, from April, May 2019 to August now 2022, the relationship between the two sides is pretty close to being fractured. I've taken part in a number of meetings, both in person and online, where there have been senior former US officials, as well as some who will be at the review conference. And the US position, as I understand it, is that there can be no discourse or negotiations with Russia until the conflict in Ukraine is stopped and the status quo ante restored of 23 February 2021. And there will be no discussions on follow-on treaty to New START or any other issue. So in that sense, I'm quite concerned. Now, Dr. Orlov mentioned the statement. I always have problems when it is referred to as a statement of the P5. And both Russians and Americans take issue with me, but I'm correct. The statement in January was called the statement by the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states. That's the correct title. You can check it. The United States, as usual, on the White House website, put it up as the P5 statement. And they, within half an hour, they had to take it down and put up a revised version with the correct title. So the P5 in the Security Council have no connection with nuclear weapons. The UN Charter does not mention anything about the permanent members of the Security Council having nuclear weapons. And my contention is that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who under Chapter 7 have been given a special responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security are in fact the greatest proliferators of nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, and chemical weapons. I mean, that's the record, largest possessors. So in my view, they have very little credibility coming from that context to come and preach to others. But having gotten that off my chest, there are many terms that are now in use: risk reduction, strategic stability, crisis stability, first strike stability, arms race stability, strategic stability. And we find these terms in various NPT documents, but there is no agreed definition. What is strategic stability? How do we know that we are in a situation of strategic stability? Is it a quantitative definition? Is it a qualitative definition? How do we know that? It's very difficult, and it basically slides all over the place. And then usually the discussion on strategic stability in the same sentence later on, at least in the NPT context, and also in some General Assembly resolution, also talks about undiminished security for all. So nuclear weapon states can always argue that if I reduce nuclear weapons, given the current context, my security will be diminished. And so we get into a circular, or what I call an oxymoronic argument, where we have not made progress now for decades because we want strategic stability, we want undiminished security for all, and then basically nothing happens. I was actually very taken by a recent presentation by Brad Roberts from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, who, as you know, was the lead on the Obama administration's nuclear posture review. And he, in his presentation, gave a prognosis that if we use the counting rules of New START and we look at the holdings of United States, Russia, and China in 2027. So as you know, the counting rules on New START are 700 deployed launches, ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, and 800 deployed and non-deployed, which means the two sides can have 100 non-deployed. And then the limit on warheads is 1,550 on either side. And then, as you also know, the counting rules for heavy bombers is 1 warhead, even though they may carry up to 20 on cruise missiles or gravity bombs. So according to Brad Roberts, if we extrapolate to 2027, based on his calculations, in 2027, one could expect the United States to have the deployed launches using start counting rules somewhere around 675. The Russian figure, according to him, would be 510. But interestingly for him, the Chinese figure would be 542, so more than Russia. And then again, using new start counting rules, his calculation for deployed warheads would be for the United States 1,457, for Russia 1,447, and for China 702. And then the third category was if we count the launches both deployed and non-deployed, the US 800, the full complement, Russia 764, and China 603. So what he was trying to show is that in the next round, it cannot be only bilateral. Russia, US, one also has to bring in China. And as we all know, the Chinese position is they are not coming to the negotiating table until the two other sides come down to their numbers. But if we use Brad Roberts' numbers, then the Chinese, in a sense, will be in a difficult position in the next few years if they are building up and approaching, at least at the level of launchers, what the holdings of the two largest nuclear powers might be. And he also had another interesting data point is that today, the United States looks for, or it needs a counterforce targeting requirement of 600 targets. But by 2026, using the extrapolated data that I just mentioned, the US would need to hold at risk 1,100 targets. So it means nearly a doubling. So the question then is, where do we get with nuclear arms control? What happens with the New START treaty? And as was mentioned by Dr. Orlov, before February and following on from the Geneva meetings in June of last year with the Strategic Stability Dialogue, the two sides were talking about discussing all types of nuclear warheads. Because a nuclear warhead is neither strategic nor tactical. It depends on the delivery system. A delivery system can carry a big warhead with a megaton range, or a delivery system can carry a quote unquote small warhead in the kiloton range or even sub-kiloton range. It depends on the launcher. If it's on a certain launcher, it's under the INF treaty terms, it's a shorter or intermediate range weapon. If it's on a longer range, over 5,500 kilometers, then it's a strategic weapon. So, but the warhead itself, in that sense, is neutral. It just depends what is carrying it. So again, how do we deal with this issue? Now, as you know, in 2018, the United States launched this creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament, which later became creating the environment for nuclear disarmament. But it really didn't contribute to any discussion on how to bring about the next round of nuclear arms control. Then the Stockholm Initiative talks about stepping stones, and they want to set up a working group coming out of the NPT review conference to deal with strategic stability and risk reduction. Again, we don't know what these two terms mean. And now if Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, how do we take the Stockholm Initiative? Because that was at that time put forward by a country that was neutral. But now this country will be entering an alliance which relies on nuclear weapons. The new NATO strategic concept will be coming out later this month. And in my view, it will reiterate that NATO remains a nuclear alliance, and as long as there are nuclear weapons, NATO will retain nuclear weapons, including forward deployed nuclear weapons, which are in Europe. So again, we don't know how to deal with this issue. Now, on the CTBT, those of you who might be members of the CTBT youth group will probably hate me for this comment, but I think the CTBT is dead. We need to recognize that. The 8 remaining Annex II countries, we have seen zero progress. We know what the conditions are under which the Middle Eastern countries will join the CTBT. Nobody has come up with a solution how to get India and Pakistan to even sign the treaty. And then let alone North Korea, which might be preparing yet another nuclear test. So this is frozen now with 36 of the 44 ratified, but 8 having not ratified, and soon we'll be coming up with whatever anniversary it is when the treaty opened for force in 1996. So I think the way for dealing with this is to maintain a no testing norm. But the reason why I raised this is that I saw an interview on CNN by a very hawkish retired American general who was commenting on the Ukraine war. And he said it is time for the United States to detonate a small nuclear device over the South Pacific to send a message to Moscow that it needs to stop the attacks on Ukraine. And also now the view of people like him is that Ukraine is approaching a situation where it can defeat the Russian army. And that is now the objective, which is why you're seeing more and more longer range and heavy weapons from NATO going into Ukraine, and the Ukrainian president making statements where it seems he's ready to fight until the last Ukrainian is left standing. But somebody else has pointed out that Russia too could do the same. They could detonate a small nuclear device in or over Novaya Zemlya. It wouldn't hurt anyone. It would shake the ground. Again, it would send an important message that, if the Russian situation was deteriorating in the Ukrainian theater and quote unquote, if the Russian forces were facing defeat, would this be a viable signaling measure that, this is it? We have reached the end of our tether here, and support for Ukraine needs to stop. There needs to be some settlement. Again, these are open questions that, at least in Vienna, some people are discussing, and I'm sure they will come up at the NPT review conference as well. And finally, I wanted to point out that nuclear risk reduction is not something new. We already have a number of instruments. You might remember the Incidents at Sea agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States, prevention of dangerous military activities. These are both from the late 1980s. Very few people remember this. And we are already in dangerous times with US and NATO airplanes and Russian airplanes are coming very close to each other's airspace. They are engaging in dangerous activities, both on sea and in the air. A part of this is grandstanding, part of this is signaling, part of this is trying to figure out, what the chain of command will be once the threshold rises. A few years ago, you might remember a Chinese fighter plane intercepted an American intelligence gathering plane just outside Chinese waters. The two planes collided. The poor Chinese pilot died. The American plane was damaged heavily. It landed in China and then was returned to the US in a box after being dismantled. So nuclear risk reduction is not something new. We should remember what we have already on the table and not start from a plain piece of paper. And people also forget that there is also this agreement on the prevention of nuclear war going back to 1973. So we have a lot of Cold War achievements that people have forgotten and pretending as they don't exist. Part of this is, in my view, a lack of expertise and knowledge among the new diplomats that are coming up. And part of it is deliberately ignoring what has existed in the past. Something I wanted to say earlier, and this is my final comment. While the nuclear weapon state statement in January was important, the 5 of them agreed for the first time that a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. But they forgot 2 very key elements of the Reagan-Gorbachev agreement. They not only said war cannot be won and must never be fought, they also said in the same paragraph, and it's on that basis that they made the first statement, that any war between the 2 sides would be catastrophic and that the 2 sides must avoid both a conventional and a nuclear war between them. And neither side would seek military superiority. And it is interesting that the weapon states, particularly the Russians and Americans, only remember that we cannot win and therefore shouldn't fight a nuclear war. And they forget that one also has to agree not to seek military superiority over the other side, and also not to engage in a proxy war. The Ukraine war now really is a proxy war. And again, this is very dangerous. So my comments were not that well structured, but I just wanted to put those before you and be happy to answer some questions for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Tariq. And yeah, we are indeed moving on to the discussion and Q&A session. Well, I suggest that we structure it as follows. We have as participants some of leading Russian and foreign experts, Dr. Baranovsky, Professor Squassoni, Mr. Kuchinov, Dr. Krivolapov, and we indeed would, I think, benefit from hearing their comments or questions at this point. And afterwards, we would proceed to questions from the broader audience so that we can address everything just step by step. And I see the raised hand of Dr. Baranovsky, so the floor is yours.
Then maybe, well, I have a couple of comments, but maybe I could start by asking Tariq Rauf one question before he leaves. And this is the following question. We have heard several times about some aspects which were mentioned during this conference, during this discussion, that these are not new problems. These are not new problems. Risk reduction is not a new problem, and de-escalation is not a new problem. There are many, many problems which are actually not new. May I ask Tariq Rauf, can you see something really new in the whole agenda of problems that we are interested in?
Thank you very much. I think, in my view, there aren't new problems, but there are new elements to old existing problems. So I would put hypersonic missiles and novel technologies, nuclear-powered missiles, and so on, as being a new element, but part of an old conflict or confrontation, so to speak. The only new thing might be, whether or not use of nuclear weapons is contemplated and the nuclear taboo might be broken after 70 plus years, but people are not really taking that very seriously. This is more a media thing and something on Twitter and Facebook, but more serious people, despite the situation in Europe, are not that concerned. Of course, nobody can ever rule anything out, but I think that part of the discussion in the media or the public space, in my view, seems to be a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, Dr. Baranovsky, you previously said that you had some comments to add afterwards, right?
Oh, okay, then let me say the following. I think that it's very timely discussion. It's very good that PIR Center decided to organize this. It's very useful, and we all have been able to see that there is a long range of problems which have to be addressed, have to be discussed, and this is really good that we have this opportunity. But this also creates a problem. And the problem is that we have too many of these problems. And we have been discussing these problems for a very long period. And many of them continue to be not settled, not addressed. And if we want to mention them all during just 1 hour and a half of discussion, then there is a big question. We have additional value in this discussion by just mentioning many of these problems, which is useful, which is important. These problems really do exist, but as Tariq Rauf said, many of them are not new. There are new problems. There are new problems, and maybe it would be much more important just try to focus upon a couple of problems which create a new situation in the whole area. But which, what kind of area? Actually, I also do not know how to define this, because the subject of this conference is actually it's important, but it's about everything. It's about strategic stability or the lack of strategic stability. It's about Europe and Asia. It's about escalation and about risk reduction. So this covers everything. I don't know what would be more important to focus upon. All at least many issues that were mentioned, they are extremely important. It was said during the discussion that the conflict in and around Ukraine has to some extent overshadowed other problems. I think it's true. And these other problems, they do exist, and they will require a very serious attention. But I think since we all know how important this problem of conflict in and around Ukraine, then maybe it's important to focus exactly about what is new. What is new with the emergence of this new conflictual situation? Something was said, and that's important. There are a lot of discussion from this point of view. I think that I would be interested in focusing analytically upon one dimension of this problem. Again, I'm stressing it's analytical focus, not so to say political analysis, without discussing how this all appeared and what are the sources of the conflict. But I think that what is here new, it's exactly the situation when we have a conflict which we have never had before, at least until recently. We have a conflict which is very, excuse me, it could sound cynically, but it's very interesting from analytical point of view. We have a proxy, a kind of a proxy, not war. In Russia, they do not, they prefer not to use this word. Let's say proxy military conflict, a proxy military operation, where the major nuclear powers are involved. And I think this nuclear factor here, it was mentioned several times during today's discussion. I think it's a very important element of this conflict. And I have here two questions which I have to raise to address this question to myself or to the analytical community as a whole. And actually, this is usually the question which is often mentioned about nuclear factor with respect to this conflict. The first question is whether this conflict could go nuclear. And the second question, what is the role of nuclear factor in the emergence and the development of this conflict? And I believe that this is something which is really very basic, very basic. The issue of prospects of this conflict turning into a nuclear conflict, this was discussed, and I think that there is a more or less overwhelming opinion of the analytical community that this is not a perspective which should be and could be over dramatized. I could mention what was said just a few days ago by Rose Gottemüller, who was the head of the American delegation in negotiations with Russia on strategic nuclear weapons. She said, and again, this was, I think, just a week ago, she said the chances of nuclear use are greater than 1%, but they are not 10%. So it is between 1% and 10%. So it's a low chance. The chances are relatively low. But she said in the same statement, she said, but the consequences of a single nuclear weapon, whether a demonstration strike or in any other way, have to be taken extremely seriously. And so we have this very contradictory situation. The chances of the conflict going nuclear are relatively low, but even if it is less than 10%, should this be considered as something deserving very serious attention? So I think that my first question, which have to be addressed by the analytical community, it is the question about the possible scenarios, dramatic scenarios, which could bring about this development, which could have really very catastrophic consequences. Scenarios which could bring the escalation from conventional stage to the nuclear stage. What are the scenarios? What is new with this conflict? How this could take place? Well, logically, what should be done in order, and is there something that could be done in order to prevent this development? This is one analytical question. And another analytical question is also about this conflict, the role, as I said, the role of nuclear factor in the emergence and of the development of this conflict. look, may have a very specific sense. It is a conflict in which two major nuclear superpowers are involved. One is a direct participant, another one is an indirect participant, but they are both the biggest nuclear powers. They are both actually have a very specific interactions in various fields concerning nuclear factors and also in terms of nuclear deterrence. So my question is the following: to which extent nuclear deterrence has worked and will continue to operate in the relations between these two countries when they are actually in an almost direct conflict. It's not a direct conflict, but it is a military. It's a military conflict. It's a conflict which has very considerable military aspects, and the question is whether nuclear deterrence has affected the development of this conflict. And we could, if we analyze the statement and some documents and many other things, we could see that nuclear deterrence, that there were attempts to use the factor of nuclear deterrence in order to affect the opposite side. Are there any results? Are there any results? Is a nuclear factor something which deter the opponent from doing something? Russia is a nuclear power, but this has not deterred United States from helping Ukraine and from helping Ukraine in a very serious way. But to which extent this nuclear deterrence has affected American behavior and American actions with respect to this conflict? United States is involved, but there are some limits of this involvement. And what are the red lines? And do they exist, these red lines, which cannot be crossed in order not to have the catastrophic development of the further process of this? So I think that there are very important analytical questions that have to be addressed very seriously, to which we do not have very obvious questions, and which creates a situation which makes the situation rather unstable and rather dangerous.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baranovsky. Yeah, your insights were very important to us, and they really correspond somehow to what was discussed yesterday. It is important that we need to focus on scenarios, on real scenarios. And well, during our presentation today, we really discussed only two types of scenarios, and those are the types that were mentioned yesterday. So one is something resulting from incidents, and well, one or two kinds of incidents were mentioned, and the other type of escalation scenarios is really something resulting from political dynamics. Well, and as far as the effectiveness of deterrence is concerned, well, it seems like it is always important to remember that causation and correlation are two different things, and if something has not happened, it does not necessarily mean that deterrence has worked. And this is the key problem with understanding whether it has worked today, because indeed yesterday our participants also were saying that kind of the deterrence the deterrence logic has worked, because the US has been saying for the entire period that it will not intervene, but well, we don't really know whether the US statements on this problem have had any impact on the situation. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Squassoni for your comment or question.
Thank you. Thanks just for the opportunity to listen to some Russian views. I have to say, one thing that I think is new, and I appreciate Dr. Baranovsky's questions, they're all the right ones. You know, one thing I think is new is that I'm not sure the US really knows what Russia's objectives in Ukraine are. And that there's a lot of guesswork. And, you know, as Tariq Rauf mentioned, there are a lot of right-wing former generals saying a lot of crazy things on the news media. Another thing that's new is misinformation and disinformation in this crisis. I would, I think reiterate Dr. Topychkanov's question. One issue that should be brought up if Russia is serious about Ukrainian nuclear weapons aspirations, then there should be a thorough vetting. But I would put that, given my long history in nonproliferation, I would put that in the category of disinformation in this crisis. I think in terms of deterrence, I read Vladimir Putin's initial threats as very, very broad. And I think that he did want to deter US involvement or Western involvement in any way. And from that perspective, I would say, well, the US wasn't deterred. But other people look at the kinds of assistance we've given and said, well, if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, we would certainly put a no-fly zone in there. There are a lot of different views on this. I would contend, not only do we not want a nuclear war with Russia, we don't want a conventional war with Russia. That is not in our interest. It's not in anyone's interest, honestly. However, one has to ask, what does Russia have to gain here? And here I would go back to something that Dr. Orlov said at the beginning when he mentioned the US-Cuban missile crisis and who makes the rules. And obviously, stationing those missiles on Cuba, that didn't violate any treaty, right? But it was a step too far. And I would say that one way in which we have been talking past each other for 20, 30 years is a lack of understanding on the US's part about Russian security concerns and the expansion of NATO. And I do not think that US policymakers truly understand the security concerns there. But I will say that these actions in Ukraine violate the Budapest Memorandum. And that is one area which I think is very serious, has very serious implications for the NPT in terms of what, non-nuclear weapon states can expect in terms of security guarantees. So I think this is pretty negative for I don't think we had a good position in the NPT going into the conference. I would agree that, that it's very hard to build trust between the US and Russia until this conflict is resolved one way or the other. I will simply, put that out there, but that I think the US would be more than ready to, the US understands the importance of arms control and strategic stability. And even though it's very difficult right now, I think the US would be prepared, definitely prepared to talk. I think Tariq has left us here, but I wanted to make one objection, and that is, this Ukraine is not a proxy war. It's wrong to characterize it as such. It's a tragedy for everybody involved. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Squassoni, for your very insightful comment. We have very little time, so I see Egor Chobanyan's hand. So I hope that this comment or question is very brief, right?
Yeah, right. I have a brief question. And actually, I would like to keep on the topic which was already mentioned before. It's about nuclear deterrence. So recently, Foreign Affairs and Economist, they released articles on the point of nuclear threats and actual nuclear deterrence in the Ukrainian conflict. So actually, I would just want to hear opinions of our experts about these nuclear threats. So some analysts wrote in their articles that these threats, they set a bad precedent for other countries. And it was mentioned about China that it can use the same threats when trying to solve their own conflicts, about Pakistan and other countries which already possess nuclear weapons, and for future possible countries which can have nuclear weapon. So at this point, my question is about the point and the meaning of these nuclear threats, because with these threats, actually, we observe reduction of US helps to Ukraine. And after, you know, this talks about nuclear using of nuclear weapon, conventional nuclear weapon, US decided not to send some sort of weapons to Ukraine. So I just want to, you know, hear this on this question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Igor. I think that this question had several dimensions. So what the use of some nuclear-related rhetoric with regard to Ukraine could bring to other regional conflicts, and what it can bring specifically to US-Russia relations and the conflict in Ukraine. I think that Dr. Topychkanov has already touched upon part of this question. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on Igor's question, and probably some other speakers might jump into.
Thank you so much, Artem and Igor, for your question. So this question brings us back to the signaling system between Russia and the world. And previously, Professor Squassoni mentioned that the Russian objectives are not clear. For instance, in the United States, I would say I can confirm these objections are not clear even here in Russia for many, because there are so many concerns, reasons mentioned in the official statements about why Russia is in Ukraine right now, militarily. And because of that, if you don't have a very clear picture of your objectives, then the mentioning nuclear weapons in this context bring us the very ambiguous situation. And somehow it's a problem, somehow it's a tool. It's already covered in scientific literature, the role of ambiguity in nuclear bargaining or nuclear deterrence or nuclear weapons policies. And Russia used this tool as well as other countries as well. And if you follow, for instance, the Russian nuclear doctrine with the most recently published document about nuclear deterrence, you could see that the language is quite vague in this document. And many depended on how you interpret these statements in this document about Russian intention to use nuclear deterrence into nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict, risking the survival of the Russian state. This is the first part, the ambiguity. Ambiguity is a tool, and we can see that Russia uses in the conflict. Another point is, and somehow I can see that during these 3 months of the armed conflict in Ukraine, somehow the situation is improved when Russian officials started quite often repeating that this conflict doesn't have a nuclear dimension and Russia has no intention to use nuclear weapons. We could see this more and more often. It's now, from this point of view, of course, it doesn't rule out the concerns related to the statement by President Putin or by Dmitry Medvedev and others at the beginning of the conflict right now. But if the message, for instance, from NATO countries, from the United States, from Ukraine, from others to Russia would be, let's be clear, please confirm that today, tomorrow, after tomorrow, every day, that you have no intention to consider using nuclear weapons. It would help Russia to be very clear and to limit this ambiguity as a tool in this conflict. So, to be short, the ambiguity remains a tool, and it's not a secret that other nuclear weapons states use ambiguity as a tool of their nuclear weapons policies. But if other countries put pressure and using a dialogue and the pressure as an instrument, as a channel how to deal with the situation, it would help to limit this ambiguity and to avoid repeating these nuclear threats in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Topychkanov. So I see no hands, so probably other speakers do not want to add anything on this issue, right? So if so, I will just hand it over to Dr. Vladimir Orlov for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Artem. I would start with thanking you, Artem, and PIR Center's team for preparing and organizing this very timely discussion, which I think is to be continued in other formats at other platforms. I have no intention just to make any summaries of today's discussion, also because we already got some summary from Artem of our yesterday's Chatham House exchange with our American and other and European colleagues. So no need for that Matryoshka summary in the summary here. Just two points which please do not consider as a summary of our discussion. First, risk of nuclear war. I think Rose Gottemiller's measurements, which were brought by academician Baranovsky today to our smorgasbord, and I think we can guess here, but it is true that the risk of nuclear war is above zero. It is not zero. And actually, when we started, I suggested that we look tut azimut in different directions here. Some of us take for granted this statement by the P5 on the nuclear war. But it is not. Actually, we should applaud, among others, the Democratic administration in the United States for this, what seems to be an easy step. But again, it was not. I remember my conversations with people in the previous US administration, and without naming names, they still are on government service. I asked them directly, why, under Trump, why don't you want just to repeat the Reagan-Gorbachev formula? They said, because we don't believe in it. We believe in nuclear war, that it can be fought and it can be won. And they gave me one example, what they had believed could be a nuclear conflict with use of nuclear weapons, which United States could win, in their opinion. That was around the PRK, around North Korea. So what I'm saying is that there may be different scenarios here and there, but the nuclear factor in its practical dimension is not gone. So mostly political weapon, but not exclusively, which probably would keep our headaches for considerable time. And the second point, which Tariq so elegantly, as always, brought to our discussion, reminding us on two elements: undiminished security for all and no military superiority. And when words are put on paper but are not followed by actions, this may provoke at some point a reaction which also is against certain previously signed or agreed document. So that interconnection between commitments, political commitments, legally binding commitments, that's a serious thing. Just we cannot, I used the smorgasbord parallel just a few seconds ago, but we cannot in this particular context look at this topic as smorgasbord, just picking, choosing what is useful, what seems to be more important in this particular moment. There are legitimate security concerns of my country which were completely ignored. Of course, that deafness, that ignorance of those security concerns could be considered as provocation by itself. And I do think, after my conversations here in Europe with government colleagues, that my European counterparts are so well informed, so smart, so wise, that they do realize Russia's security concerns. Of course, the question is what it means. They may realize them, but they may disagree with them, or they may act differently by themselves or under external pressures from other non-European players. So I would not put the situation in the format that nobody knows what goes on, nobody knows whose interests are, nobody knows. Well, there is ambiguity for sure, which is part of the military plan. But on the other hand, there are signalings, there are reactions, there is digesting. And of course, I think we need to do as much as we can to minimize as much as we can bringing the nuclear factor on the scene today. With that, thank you all so much for your wisdom, for your very helpful comments. This is not a meeting aimed at consensus document. We call it Wednesday brainstorming, midweek brainstorming session, Научная среда, which hopefully provided some brainstorming for all of us, myself included. Thank you so much and great to see you all. Thank you. Bye.